the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion series. This series highlights partners' work, practices, and views on themes related to the built environment, climate, and finance. In this very first episode, we are bringing the issue of gender and social inequalities to focus in the discussion around decarbonized buildings. I am your host, Farah Kobaisi from CIDT. I am joined today with Annabel Short. She's a senior advisor on the built environment with the Institute of Human Rights and Business. She is also a strategist for nonprofits and foundations and writes the newsletter It's Material. You can also read her report entitled Dignity by Design, Human Rights and the Built Environment Life Cycle. Welcome, Annabel. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to have this discussion with you today.
Thank you, Farah, and looking forward to the conversation as well.
So to start, there's no doubt that decarbonized buildings provide a variety of benefits to people on the level of their health and overall well-being. However, expanding decarbonized buildings without seeking social inclusion and gender equality can have negative outcomes on gender and social inequalities and can reinforce marginalization. For instance, there's evidence that decarbonization in the built environment in its current model is contributing to rising real estate values, driving gentrification, and making poorer residents paying a high price on social, economic, and health levels, particularly for Black migrants and women, and especially women-headed households. So my first question to you, Annabel, is how does your organization approach the issue of decarbonization in the built environment from a social and gender equality lens?
It's such an important question, and particularly at this time when the urgency of decarbonizing is so strong and when there is momentum in many regions and cities to do so. So like any climate mitigation or adaptation process, the way that it's done, as you said, has significant impacts on the lives of people. Two specific areas we'd highlight. One is around the area of housing rights. And for example, if you imagine a single mother juggling 3 jobs in a rent stabilized or affordable home, but facing the risks of the renovation process for that building, causing her to maybe lose that home or not be able to make ends meet in terms of paying for it. These are real risks that we need to think about in people's daily lives. And it's really going to take a combination of governments, both at national but also local level, thinking about how the finance for this process flows and is done in a way that really bears in mind the risks to people. And then also financial actors themselves, and moving away from a process that's just trying to conduct decarbonization in a way that maximizes short-term profits as quickly as possible without thinking about the impacts on the ground. The other area, as you said, is workers' rights, and a question of who's going to have these jobs? How will it impact workers who are already in the unionized construction industries? And also, how do we create possibilities for a pipeline? For example, for immigrant workers, you often see 2 tracks of workers in construction, unionized workers and then migrant workers who are often ununionized and vulnerable to exploitation. So how do we think about this process as potentially an opportunity to really strengthen that pipeline into good unionized jobs and be sure that the new green jobs in construction don't erode existing labor rights protections where they exist. Finally, gender runs through all of this and in multiple ways, but one is absolutely in terms of who's making the decisions. And it's really clear, for example, that the built environment industries, whether you're thinking finance, architecture, engineering, construction, are still pretty male dominated. And that has not only an impact in terms of women's ability to thrive in those professions and grow within them, but actually in terms of the way that different questions are thought about and processes are prioritized. So that's something fundamental that we want to see change as well.
However, the approach you are speaking from is not a mainstream one, right? So rarely climate issues in general and decarbonization in specific are approached from an intersectional lens. Usually, decarbonization and social and gender inequalities, women's rights, workers' rights, residents' rights are discussed separately as separate issues. So what and who do you think we are excluding when we follow a single issue discussion or build a single issue narrative on climate and decarbonization?
Such an important question as well. First, I'd say that, the way that people experience climate issues is completely intersectional. If you have somebody who's pushed out of the place where they live because of a climate disaster, they're experiencing that on the level of multiple components of their life: their ability, their age, their gender, their race, their migration status. So I absolutely think it's a no-brainer to also be thinking about the ways that the solutions to the impacts of climate are approached, also take an intersectional lens. But you're right, at the moment there is very much that siloization. In finance, it's very clear, for example, you'll often see people think about the E in climate impacts and imagine that the S is something separate from that. And one thing that we're really trying to do is actually demonstrate that the way that the way the climate processes happen, has to take into account the social implications of those. And two things that I think that you're missing by not doing that. One is the ability to really scale up climate action. And if you think about the fact that you need political will to do this, and you can't build political will with just a small group of people advocating for something. You need to, really demonstrate what is in this for workers who are worried about losing their jobs. What is in this for people who are worried about housing prices? What is in this for climate advocates too? And it can be extremely challenging, but also powerful and really important to bring those different perspectives to, generate the will to drive change at scale. And then secondly, one of the risks I'd say of not doing this is what I sometimes describe as a solutioneering approach, that, focuses largely on the important and necessary technical changes that need to happen to drive climate mitigation. But the risk of that is then it's developed in a very narrow and technical way, and the risk then being that the people who then benefit are just a few who are involved in that process, and you're actually deepening inequality in the process. And you could easily fast forward to different visions of cities which take one approach vis-a-vis taking the other, for example.
But moving to the cities you just mentioned, what roles can they play in making decarbonized buildings more equitable and improve the residents' lives?
Oh, so many. This is something I'm particularly passionate about, is recognizing the multiple different powers that cities have, albeit recognizing that just like national governments, they can be prone to corruption in certain instances. They have definitely budget constraints. So you don't want to, overemphasize the influence that all cities can play across all areas. However, one is in the area of legislation, of course. So you're always going to have companies that are getting out front, that want to lead on this. But actually, particularly in the built environment sector, I see this need to, raise the floor, raise a level playing field, and actually incentivize business to do the right thing. And you do need legislation to do that, whether it's on reducing the number of emissions from certain sizes of buildings, whether it's in terms of, rent protections or housing measures to ensure that tenants' rights are protected. So legislation. Another is around land zoning, planning questions, and the spatial justice considerations around how does the investment in responding to climate change flow throughout different parts of the city? Are we just protecting our financial districts? Because yes, they're important, but that's clearly, not the city as a whole. Or are cities really thinking about the needs of different areas and neighborhoods throughout the whole city? three other areas: procurement. So cities themselves have huge procurement power, and there are examples of that, whether it's in terms of a city thinking about the materials that are going into construction and shaping that market, for example, whether it's requiring a certain amount of diversion from landfill for building materials. There are multiple ways that cities can harness their procurement powers. They're owners of buildings. And so the more leadership that we can see from cities in terms of saying we're committing to getting this approach right and doing it fairly within our own buildings, and again, throughout the whole city, that then helps to generate confidence on the private sector side as well to follow suit. And finally, there's the role that cities play almost as advocates. And you see that especially when national governments might be rolling back on human rights protections, rolling back on climate protections. Often it's progressive cities who are pushing back or saying, no, we are going to meet the goals of the Paris Accord ourselves, or we are going to welcome refugee and immigrant populations. We are going to create a safe space for LGBTQI members of our cities, and so on and so forth. So many ways that cities can play a leadership role here.
And building on this, what modalities of engagement can the different communities have to influence such policies on the local or city level?
That's an important question and goes to the point around participation and how it's opened up and who can participate. And we're actually just starting this series of deep interviews with people who've worked on different participation processes to say, was this initiated? What worked? But also, what were the challenges? So it can happen on multiple levels, right through from a city wanting input on a policy through to early engagement around a specific project and how that's going to develop. And in both instances, ensuring that there's time invested up front to really engage the people who need to be engaged in a very substantive way can reap huge benefits down the road. Changing the direction of the plans, making sure that they're more sustainable for the long term, making sure people feel connected to that particular project or policy. And in that process, activating people more widely to say, oh my God, my voice does count here, I'm going to become more engaged in other ways as well. So I think there are all actors in the built environment really need to be thinking about the ways that this is done and doing it intentionally, and recognizing even if it means a slower process at the outset or more investment of time, it reaps dividends. And being really thoughtful, and this is where I should bring in, the human rights lens that we come to with all of this. Some people have more capacity, time, ability to participate in processes than others. So needing to be really conscious through those processes around things like, when are events held? Is it going to be mostly people who are retired or students who are participating? Who's not going to be able to join? And how can we open up that avenues? Might be things like different times of day, different platforms, different physical spaces, different languages. But I really do think that that's an important part of the process.
So what do you think about the ways in which Laudes Foundation can support your work in advocating for socially inclusive, decarbonized built environment?
One is to continue the path you're on. I remember when I saw the announcement that one of the priorities would be built environment, kind of just going, yes, because it's something that I'd sort of, through many years of work from different angles, just became so convinced is really important and needed, as challenging as it could be. So absolutely continue on this path. Second is, I already see Laudes doing it, but continuing is being harnessing your powerful role as convener and connector, being able to join the dots, having that sort of bird's eye view, systemic view is wonderful. And the way in which the built environment stream, along with others, garments and finance, are being seen through this collective umbrella, which I think is extremely important in terms of framing. The system is ultimately similar, whichever sector you're talking about. So we really need to think along that systemic path. The only other area I'd say would be, I'd be remiss in not saying, the more core aligned approaches to funding, obviously, as with all funders, are taken, the better So providing the guiding path and the overarching framework and convening, while ensuring that grantees have the bandwidth to pivot when we need to pivot. God knows COVID has taught us the importance of that. And adjust strategies as they need to be adjusted, which I know is underway. On the convening side also, I think there's a lot of role to bring other philanthropic partners on board with this, and it involves sort of communicating and demonstrating quite how powerful and influential the built environment is in people's lives, and therefore the ways that intersects with the issues that they're working on and the change that they want to drive.
That's it for this episode. Thank you, Annabel, for taking the time to speak to me today, and thank you all for listening. Until next time, bye.